Okay, so now we have a nice system to save and load our localized text, but we don't have a way to create or edit our localized text data in Unity. Well, not to save it. Right now we have a nice system to load our localized text, but we don't have a way to create or edit our localized text data in Unity. Is a more accurate statement. So for this, we're going to write a simple editor window script, which will allow us to create new data. If we wanted to add another language, for example, load and edit existing data and save the changes we've made. And so since we want to create an editor script in Unity, we need to add an editor folder, a folder called editor, to our scripts folder, and then create the new C# script inside there. This is going to be called Localized Text Editor, and we are going to double click it to open it for editing. And so, because we're writing an editor script, the first thing we need to write is we need to add the namespace declaration using Unity Editor, and this is not going to inherit from mono behavior, it's going to inherit from editor window, right? Because that's what it's going to be. We can delete start and update because we're not going to use them, this being an editor window. And then, so the first thing we're going to do is allow our editor window to create new localization data. So each of the main things that our window is going to do will have its own function. So we're going to have functions for create, save, and load, and then we're going to use onGUI to do the editing. So we're going to start with a private function that returns void called create new data. And in it, we are going to need a public localization data variable, which we're going to call localization data. And localization data needs to be public because we're going to serialize it. And we are going to then set localization data to equal a new instance of localization data. So if we don't have any data, we're going to create a new localization data object. And once we've created our data, we're going to want to be able to save it. So we're going to add a private function that returns void called saveGameData. And if you guys saw the quiz game training, this is actually very similar editor script to the one we did there. Now, this is one way that it's different. So since we may potentially be working with multiple files, or we almost inevitably will be working with multiple files, since the point is to support multiple languages, we'll want to give the user a choice for where to save the data they've created, and we're going to do this using editorUtility.SaveFilePanel. So editorUtility.SaveFilePanel returns a string for the file path chosen. So it's going to pop up a Windows save window or an OS X save window, and it takes the following arguments. It takes a string for the title of the window, a string for the directory, the default directory it's going to open in, a string for the default name of the file, and a string for the file extension. So we're going to create a new string variable called filePath, and then we're going to call editorUtility.SaveFilePanel, and we're going to pass in save localization data file for the name of the window, application.streamingAssets path for the default location, empty string for the default name, and then a string for JSON for the file type extension. Then we're going to make sure that the string for the file name is not open, is not empty before we try to save our data. So we're going to check if not string.is null or empty file path. Then we're going to serialize our localization data object to JSON, storing it in a data as JSON string, right? Because we're getting ready to save it to disk. So we're going to make a string variable called data as JSON, and that's going to be equal to JSON utility dot to JSON, right? Because we're serializing to JSON, and we're going to pass in localization data as the object to turn into JSON. And did I miss something? Why is it throwing a? Oh, I missed it. I always do this. Burp. There we go. Okay, so with that, now the next thing that we're going to want to do is write that text, that string that we've just gotten. We're going to want to write that to our file, right? So we need to add using system.io namespace, which is going to allow us to work with files. And then we'll save that string into our file using file.writeAllText. So file.writeAllText, and I lost my place. File.writeAllText. We're going to pass in the file path and data as JSON, right? So the location we're saving to is the file path, and the data that we're going to write into the file is our string data as JSON, right? So we've taken the object, turned it to JSON, written it into a file. Then that's good. And then we need to be able to load our data, right? So we're going to add another private function that returns void called load game data. And this is going to use editor utility.open file panel, right? Which takes a similar set of arguments, just not a default name. So we're going to say string file path equals editor utility.open file panel, and we're going to say the label is going to be select localization data file, and the default location we're going to open is going to be application.streamingassets path, and the extension is going to be JSON. Boop. And then we want to check if that path is valid before we're reading the data and deserializing our JSON data back into an object. So we're going to check if not string.is null or empty, just as we did file path. And then we are going to read the JSON from the file into a string. So string data as JSON equals file.readAllText file path. And then we're going to take that string and turn it back into an object using JSON utility. So now we're going to say localization data equals JSON utility dot from JSON this time, right? We used to, now we're going to use from. So we're going to go from JSON data. We're going to go from JSON into a localization data object. So we're passing it the type that we want to deserialize that data into, and then the actual data we want to use is going to be our string data as JSON. So now we've got our functionality working, and we want to be able to open an editor window using a menu in the Unity editor and display our editor for our data along with buttons to call the function that we've written. So we are first of all going to add a static function that returns void called init, and this is going to get the menu item attribute. So it's going to be in the window menu, and the entry is going to be localized text editor, and close bracket, and we are going to call editor window dot get window. The type of window that we're going to get is going to be a localized text editor, and then we're going to call show to show the window. So when you click on the menu item, it's going to, if the window's already open, it'll bring it to the front. Otherwise, it'll get us a new one. Okay. Now, for the actual, to draw the buttons and to draw the inspector that we're going to need to actually edit the data, we're going to use onGUI. So onGUI can be thought of in editor scripting as being similar to update is in a mono behavior, in that it's called pretty often. In update is called every frame. onGUI is called every time the window is brought into focus, every time it's clicked on. There's a few other cases where it's called, but it's called pretty often, and it's used to update to draw the window whenever anything changes. So in onGUI, the first thing that we're going to do is we need to check if our localization data is null or not before we allow users to edit or save, right? So we're going to say if localization data does not equal null, nope, no, not that, does not equal null, then we're going to create a serialized object from this window. So this is a way of handling any Unity objects in a generic way so that we can edit them easily. So we are going to create a serialized object called serialized object, and that's going to be equal to a new serialized object from this window. Then we're going to create a serialized property called serialized property, and that's going to be equal to serialized object.find property, and we're going to pass in localization data as a string as the variable that we want to display and edit. So this will get the serialized property of the game data variable, or of the localization data variable of this window, because this is the variable we want to display and edit. And then we will display an editor like you would see in the inspector panel for the serialized property. So we're going to say editor GUI layout dot property field, and we're going to pass in our serialized property, and we're going to pass in true to say that we want to be able to fold it out and edit the children. Now, then we want to update the serialized objects with any changes that the user made using the inspector, right? So we're going to call serialized object dot apply modified properties. And then we're almost done. So in this if statement, right, since we know that localization data is not null, then we're going to allow the user to save. So we're going to say if we're going to draw GUI layout.button, we're going to draw a button, and the label for it is going to be save data. And if somebody clicks on it, we're going to call, you guessed it, save game data. Now, outside of these braces, right, we're going to do the same thing for load and create. So if GUI layout button load data, so we're going to draw a button for load data, and if somebody clicks on it, we're going to call load game data, and the same thing for create new data. And that is everything that we need, right? So we have our three functions that can be called from our three buttons, one of which is only going to be displayed if there's data that's either been loaded or created. We are able to draw our property field for our data that we want to edit, so we can edit it in the same way that we would edit it in the inspector, and we can read and write that from our text files. So hit OK, hit save. That should be good. And let's jump back over to Unity and give it a test. So we're going to go to the window menu, and we will see that we now have a localized text editor option. Click on it. It's going to open up and give us the choice to load data or create new data. Let's choose to load data. Pops up our open file dialog. Let's open the German data. Hit open. And we get a null ref. Something went wrong. What happened? Okay, so my stupidity leads us to an excellent teaching opportunity here, which is that I failed to make localization data serializable, right? So we need to have the system.serializable attribute for both of these. Ugh. Okay, there you have it, folks. This is why live coding on the internet is dangerous. So all the way back in the beginning of the class, I forgot to add the system.serializable attribute to localization data, which is why I was then getting an error all the way at the end in my localized text editor, which I did type correctly. So, okay, so let's return to Unity and test. Window, localized text editor. Now we see we have an option to load the data or create new data. If we create new data, it's going to create a new empty items array, which we can then manually fill in, or we can load one of the template files that came with the project, and that's going to show us that we have entries for game title and start button, and we can edit the key, and we can edit the value, and we can add new ones as needed. So yes, make sure that if you want to be able to serialize a class, that you actually add the system.serializable attribute to it. And that is our show for today. So, little bump in the road at the end there, but happily that was the only major bump, so not too bad. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to hang out and take a few questions. Actually, yeah, I have a little bit of time. So I can take a couple of questions. And for those of you who are out now, thanks so much. Always great to see some new folks in the chat, and great to see the returning regulars. And we will be back in 2 weeks.